Hey, what's up, everyone? Today is 9 years since the decanonization and discontinuation of the Star Wars Expanded Universe, now branded Legends. What I thought it would be helpful to do is to run through the various arguments that have been advanced over the last 9 years, almost a decade. It's pretty hard to believe about why the Expanded Universe, now Legends, should be continued. There are a number of fans who still, for instance, think that the EU had its day and that what happened was a good thing. There are even EU fans who think that basically it's time to sort of move on. Let me just advance some of the arguments that have been presented over the years, just the ones that I've seen. Try to make this as sort of neutral as possible. Again, imagine me just sort of like trying to analyze the landscape of the expanded universe fandom. These are some of the arguments that I think you see most often. There are many more. Be interested in the ones that you've seen or the ones that you make. I'd be interested in the counter arguments to see if there are counters to those within the expanded universe fandom. In no particular order, here are some of the arguments. And excuse me while I sort of look at this list off camera while we go. The first is that the expanded universe storyline wasn't over. There are still more stories to tell. And one great example of this that I'm fond of using to sort of illustrate the point is, imagine if someone were to say that, or imagine if Lucasfilm were to basically stop telling stories after Empire Strikes Back, just in the context of the movie saga. Because if, after all, Star Wars is the story in some sense of Anakin Skywalker, well, at the end of Empire Strikes Back, why tell any more, right? From a certain point of view, he's basically on top. He dominates over Luke. He sent the rebellion scurrying off. He won, right? But if we did that, we'd obviously miss out on so much more, right? So imagine in the same way what we're missing out on here, right? Fundamentally, Star Wars wasn't done with Episode 5. Expanded Universe wasn't done in 2014. Another argument, which is in some sense sort of often kind of couched in the form of counter argument, but it's basically the idea that Legends or the Expanded Universe, and I'm just going to use those interchangeably, right? So for anyone who wants to sort of nitpick about that, just for efficiency's sake, they're the same things today, okay? But Legends was coherent, canonical, and regarded by Lucas, right? And these irrelevant side arguments that have been had, by the way, prior to 2014 as well. The canon debate was always a big topic within Star Wars fandom. It had been for decades. But fundamentally, the EU, it wasn't an incoherent mess. It wasn't full of contradictions. And yes, George Lucas actually regarded it, right? And at any rate, Lucasfilm was charged with maintaining its continuity over years. So it was an official part of Star Wars storytelling. Here's another argument. Continuing it is in principle possible. One of the things that you heard back around 2014, 2015, particularly as the new films were getting rolled out, was that there was something inevitable about having to end the expanding universe in order to give any variety of reasons, greater freedom to the new storytelling teams of the new canon. Fine, let's just take that argument for granted. Then continue it along a parallel path, right? Nothing in principle stands in the way. There's nothing that they did in 2014 that makes it so impossible, right, not to continue this in some way. And that seems superficially obvious, but it's an important point to remember. In 2014, 2015, the argument was strongly advanced by opponents of the expanded universe that its end was inevitable, right? But I think the reverse is true, right? And I think, if anything, nothing in principle stands in the way, which hopefully implies that its continuation is ultimately inevitable. Here's another argument, and this is an important one in my opinion. Continuing Legends is pro Lucasfilm. One of the things that the expanding universe fandom post 2014 has been stuck with is this horrible sort of guilt by association with basically all of the cesspool gutter trash talk on the internet about how everything Lucasfilm does and everything that happens in our popular culture is just garbage, right? EU fans are actually intensely pro Lucasfilm. Why? The ones who want to continue it obviously want it to continue under Lucasfilm. So we're not here looking, for every reason to be mad at Lucasfilm. We're not the ones who say that Kathleen Kennedy ruined our childhood. Are we right to be upset by what happened in 2014? Yeah. Are we right to feel gut punched every time we see something lifted from the expanded universe and reintroduced into the new canon, even though being told in 2014 that it was all about creative freedom and trying to tell a new story? Yeah, we're entitled to feel that way. But fundamentally, we're the loyal opposition. We like Lucasfilm. Lucasfilm helped give us the expanded universe. It helped maintain it for all those years. When it took it away, and not just decanonized, but discontinued it, we were confused. Here's a loyal, as a loyal opposition, we want to see more of it. We want to work with Lucasfilm to see more of it, right? So fundamentally, a movement engaged in wanting Legends to continue is a pro Lucasfilm argument. Here's another one. The demand to continue Legends exists, is strong, and is growing. You can see this in a number of different ways. Anecdotally, the number of social media sites, channels, websites, arguments, the sales numbers, right? I mean, look at Marvel 108 a couple of years back, and although I think an argument can be made that it probably could have sold better if Lucasfilm had done anything to promote it. When you just do some comparisons using Comicron, which is the website that tracks, comic sales, right? However imperfect that data is, just compare and contrast Marvel 108 sales, a comic that came out 5 years after the official end of the expanding universe, set in the expanding universe storyline. Just look at the sales of that one shot compared to mainline Star Wars comics pre-2014. If anything, it seemed to be outpacing that, right? So stuff that was working at the time, right, was being outpaced by something that basically got zero support from Lucasfilm. Why? Because the fandom cares. The fandom still demands this stuff. And I think the numbers have grown. The number of Facebook groups and Twitter channels or Twitter accounts and YouTube channels continues to grow. The amount of energy and excitement grows. Clearly, the interest in the expanding universe grows, if only oddly by virtue of the number of ways in which the new canon continues to lift from it, right? Which then feeds a greater interest among new fans in the old stuff. So demand is there and it is growing. Here's another argument. Continuing Legends is necessary to close any narrative and continuity gaps. By ending it the way that Lucasfilm did in 2014, without giving it a real sense of an ending, with no closure, with all of these open loops throughout the entire saga, everything from, missing sequels to Dawn of the Jedi comics and books, to the huge gap between the Legacy comics and the Crucible. Where's Force Unleashed 3? The list goes on and on of the number of things the number of sort of like loose ends we need tied up. This doesn't mean that the EU was imperfect. It just means that when they ended it, we didn't get a chance to get those things that we were promised. Perhaps more important than anything, the promised retcons that are going to make sense of the Filoni Clone Wars in the context of the multimedia project Clone Wars, right? And everything else we knew about the Clone Wars pre-2008. So by discontinuing, again, not just decanonizing, but discontinuing, not allowing any further stories to be told, we're leaving tons of open gaps. And why does that matter? It matters because it just goes to show that, yes, there are stories to tell. Where would you start? You would start by making sense of those gaps. Here's another argument. Continuing Legends allows original story ideas to be told. And again, I've just on the one hand emphasized that there are tons of these open loops that need to be closed. Again, tell us what happens in The Force Unleashed 3. Vader's been arrested. How does he get out? We know he does, but we want to see that story. Tell us what happens between Crucible and Legacy, right? But what about brand new stories altogether? Stories entirely about EU original characters. Beyond just sort of like us feeling upset about not getting the promised conclusions to stories, there's a whole world of storytelling to be had. Argument. Legends is already continuing in some sense. And this is an interesting thing that I think is important to remember. Once in a while, you'll see folks say things like, well, it was a good thing that it ended, even if they may claim to be EU fans, because they say, well, at least nothing can harm it now, right? It's sort of trapped in amber. Yeah, it was decanonized. That was unfortunate. It was discontinued. That's even worse. But hey, no one can mess it up. And then you realize that actually, since 2014, it's not such a black and white case. Fantasy Flight RPG games continued the story, however ambiguously, for a number of years. SWTOR, we continue to get expansions in that, a game wholly situated inside the Legend storyline. We got Marvel 108. In addition to lots of lost and canceled projects that continue to sort of find their way into the fandom, everything from Heart of the Jedi to Lightsider and to smaller short stories, and who knows what's yet to come. There's a lot that's out there. Escape from Dagu being one notorious example. So the good news is, for folks who think we're in dire straits, actually Legends is continuing, and that's important to remember, even if what we're really arguing is like, let's take that momentum and like, let's build on it, right? Here's another argument. More Star Wars, more Legends Star Wars, it honors the old authors. And to a lesser degree, this is maybe more selfish, it honors the older fans, right? And the reason this matters is because one of these taglines that you continue to see everywhere is that more Star Wars is good for everyone. This is something you see a lot, or that Star Wars is for everyone. And as a Legends fan, you always feel slightly alienated, right, from this otherwise wonderful universal sort of, appeal, right, that like this is just for everyone. And of course, you know what they mean. Great, like anyone of any diverse station or background, right, can enjoy Star Wars. These stories are for everyone. Unfortunately, for Legends fans who want new Legend stories, right, we seem to be a little left out in the cold. So honor the old fans, but honor the authors too, the authors who helped prop up this saga through the expanded universe, the thing that kept Star Wars relevant to the point that then Disney is willing to buy it for $4 billion in 2012, right? Honor them by giving them additional opportunities to continue to tell the stories in the Legend storyline that they wanted to. Drew Karpyshyn, James Luceno, Matthew Stover, everyone who had ideas about where they wanted to go next. Let's see those stories, right? This is not necessarily an argument about giving those older EU authors opportunities in the new canon, which has happened to a small degree, particularly early on. Alan Dean Foster, James Luceno, Paul Kemp, folks like that, Timothy Zahn to an increasingly greater degree. This is about making sure that the stories that they've leaked that they want to tell that sound amazing, right? That help play a role. Going back to an earlier argument about closing these gaps, give them a chance to do that, right? Honor them, honor their contributions to Star Wars and their legacy, and live up to the motto that Star Wars really is for everyone, and that more Star Wars for everyone is good. Here's another one. Continuing Legends, continuing this storyline, actually, interestingly, allows for a greater sandbox for ideas to be lifted for the new canon, right? So this is an argument that I would make for Lucasfilm, right? To sort of selfishly say, hey, if you're looking for creative freedom, let the Star Wars expanding universe tell all sorts of crazy new stories, right? That don't impact anything in the new canon, anything in the new stories, the new TV shows, the new books, new comics, new games. Let the EU go off and tell big, wild adventures, right? And take from that what you like, right? Reintroduce those elements into the canon in the way that we see over and over, right? Whether it's with recent announcements about the Dawn of the Jedi becoming a movie, right? Very conspicuously set exactly around the same timeline as the comics in the EU, right? Even though we'd heard earlier in the new canon that the Republic wasn't that old, right? They keep lifting these ideas. The Rise of Skywalker, with the idea of the Emperor returning, right? It's Dark Empire all over again, right? It seems to be the case that every article from around 2014, 2015 that made fun of the EU for all these sorts of things they thought were silly are all now silly things that have been reintroduced into the new canon, right? So let the EU continue to be that sandbox for all these great ideas that can get lifted to further new canon storytelling, right? Everyone's better off, right? We get more EU stories, and the new canon fans get to see these stories to some degree adapted when reintroduced into their storylines, right? And I think that and I sort of hinted at this, but I think a related argument is that continuing Legend sort of in the Legend storyline, right, is what really allows for sort of like much, much bigger sort of, truly more expansive storytelling. What continuing the Legends would allow the new canon to do is to really sort of lean into whatever they want to call it, the big three, the Skywalker saga, whatever new big characters they want to set up. Whereas the EU doesn't have to just be about the big three. I know for years we've talked about what would be the fates of, say, the big three in the expanded universe. How would EU Luke die? We know he does. We see his Force Ghost and Legacy, right? But how would that happen? How would Leia die? How would Han die? What would happen to the Millennium Falcon, right? All these sorts of questions. The EU continued along a parallel path new canon with continued Legends, could maybe get into that. But I think realistically it should be much more about telling new stories about characters that originated in the EU, right? And tell more Old Republic stories, tell more Legacy era stories, right? So there'd be a neat way in which the new canon could sort of do more with its, whatever it deems to be its core characters. And the EU can be much more about telling stories about the fringes of the universe, And let's see here. Are there any more? There's lots of variants of all these, and there's lots of subclaims of all of the above. But I think this does a pretty good job of at least in about 15 minutes, sort of reminding people that whenever you hear someone say that what happened was inevitable, it should have happened, the EU sucked, Georgia didn't care about it, there's no new stories to tell, just remember that there's at least 15 minutes worth of arguments that have been advanced for the last 10 years that will continue to be advanced. And there's probably more I'm forgetting, right? And again, lots of the subclaims and stuff like that as well. In addition to lots of good counter arguments we have about a lot of the original arguments that haters of the EU or people who don't think it should continue, right, have, right? So there's nothing but arguments, I think, on our side. And keep it in mind, keep fighting. Don't become a slave to the fight. But that said, yeah, we've got a lot of good ideas on our side. There's a lot of clear pathways, I think, to continuing Legends. Nothing is in principle standing in the way, and I think it's time we continue to, you know, I have to say this too, as just an ending. One reason why I think I'm coming to terms with the term Legends is everything here that I talked about, all of these arguments, these are arguments about continuing the pre-2014 Star Wars Expanded Universe storyline, right? Which is now branded Legends. There's another very, very, very important sense in which, however, we need to explicitly lean into the Legends rhetoric, right? Around continuation. And it's in encouraging licensees to continue printing Legends content. And in some cases, printing it for the first time altogether. There are still a strange number of Star Wars adult novels that have yet to get reprinted with the Legends banner. Now, I have very mixed views about that Legends banner. I don't think it's a good thing, but one thing about several not having ever gotten that treatment is that, and it's possible that when they completely go out of print, if they haven't already, well, then no one will be able to buy them in any new state in a bookstore, right? And that's a problem. It's also true, too, that, say, just take Delway with its Essential Legends collection, reprinting what by definition can only be a certain number of, right, just the essential Legends books, right? Does this mean that at some point the old mass market paperbacks are going to disappear, fall out of print, and the only thing that will be available for newcomers to the EU are going to be just the essential Legends, leaving an impression that the whole of the pre-2014 expanded universe can be summed up in X number of books? That's problematic, to say nothing of all of the children's books and more obscure Star Wars stories that have yet to be reprinted that are really hard to find, that you can't even find digitally. It's never been more important to, well, on the one hand, make arguments for continuing the Star Wars Expanded Universe storyline along a parallel path to new canon, to also encourage licensees and Lucasfilm itself to continue Legends, right, in terms of Legends publishing projects, the Epics collections, the omnibuses, the paperbacks, give us digital versions of short stories, of children's books, right? It all needs to be out there, right? So keep pushing for new stories altogether, but keep pushing for continued Legends in the form of Legends reprints. So guys, I'd love to hear your arguments. What am I missing? I'm sure there's a ton. And hopefully we don't have to come back in another 9 years to sort of do the same thing. Hopefully we start to see more Legends in the meantime. But yeah, until then, #continue Legends.